For God's sake, Corporal, can you move any slower? It's ammo, not a Fabergé. Just drop the boxes and get out of the way of the professionals. The voice, a gravelly mix of condescension and impatience, belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, a man whose neck was as thick as his certainty. The small crowd of junior Marines and assembled observers chuckled nervously, a ripple of sycophantic laughter that echoed across the sun-baked firing range in the Mojave Desert. The heat was a physical entity, a shimmering curtain that distorted the distant targets and baked the very air you breathed into a fine, gritty dust. In the center of this universe of sweat and scrutiny stood Corporal Anna Rostova. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her movements remained unchanged, a study in methodical grace. Her focus was absolute, her hands moving with an unhurried precision that seemed to infuriate the gunnery sergeant even further. She placed a heavy ammunition can of 338 Lapua Magnum rounds onto the ground beside the sniper's nest, the metal making a soft, solid thud on the packed earth. Her uniform, though clean, was faded from 1,000 washes, fitting her small frame in a way that rendered her almost invisible, a piece of the landscape. She was in the rigid caste system of the Marine Corps, a logistician, a box kicker, a support asset whose sole purpose was to facilitate the actions of more important people. And Sullivan, a man who had spent 20 years cultivating a reputation as a hard-charging infantryman, saw her as little more than a necessary inconvenience. But when General Wallace, observing from the shaded command tent 200 yards away, focused his binoculars not on the famed Navy SEAL sniper setting up his shot, but on the corporal, he saw something else entirely. He saw the way she indexed the magazines in the case, all facing the same direction for a faster reload. He saw the subtle way she scanned the surrounding terrain, her eyes not just looking but assessing, cataloging wind vectors from the dance of distant scrub brush. He saw a stillness in her that was not passive but coiled. It was the calm of a deep river, placid on the surface, with a powerful, unstoppable current running beneath. The general lowered his binoculars, a flicker of an old memory stirring in the back of his mind. The laughter on the range died down, but the tension remained, thick and cloying. If you believe that true competence needs no introduction and that respect is earned in silence, type professional below. Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, however, was not a man to let a point go unmade, especially when he had a captive audience. He saw Rostova's silence not as disciplined composure, but as insolence or, worse, simple-mindedness. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her as she knelt to organize the remaining supplies. "You see this, Marines?" he boomed, gesturing with a thumb toward her. "This is the difference between the tip of the spear and the guys who sharpen it. We're out here dealing with ballistics, windage, Coriolis effect, life and death calculations. Corporal Rostova here is worried about her inventory sheet. Different worlds, different mindsets." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking stage whisper. "No offense, Corporal, but your biggest tactical decision of the day is probably whether to use a pen or a pencil." More nervous laughter. Rostova continued her work, her face a mask of serene neutrality. She laid out a spotting scope, a wind meter, and a data book on a small mat, aligning them perfectly with the rifle's position, her hands moving with the steady, practiced economy of a surgeon arranging her tools. She wasn't just dropping them off. She was staging them for immediate use, anticipating the sniper's needs before he even knew them. The sniper himself, a highly decorated Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer named Thorne, watched the exchange from his prone position behind the massive M210 enhanced sniper rifle. He was a legend, a man spoken of in hushed, reverent tones in armories and ready rooms across the special operations community. He ignored Sullivan entirely and gave Rostova a short, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Sullivan, catching the gesture, misinterpreted it as an act of pity for the lowly logistics clerk. "Don't you worry, Chief," Sullivan said with a smug grin. "We'll get the help out of your way, so you can get to work." Rostova finally finished her task. She rose to her feet, her movements fluid and economical, and took 2 steps back from the firing position, her posture relaxed but alert. She stood at parade rest, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on the distant 1,800-meter target. She became a statue, her silence a stark, deafening contrast to Sullivan's endless stream of self-important noise. General Wallace, still watching, felt the memory sharpen. It wasn't just her stance. It was the whole picture. The quiet efficiency, the absolute lack of ego. The way she seemed to absorb and deflect the verbal barrage without any visible effort, like a sea wall breaking waves. He had seen it before in a very different desert a long, long time ago. He had seen it in the eyes of the most dangerous people he had ever known. The exercise was the culmination of months of planning, a joint forces demonstration of advanced war-fighting capabilities. Chief Thorne was the star, tasked with neutralizing a high-value, time-sensitive target, a remote-controlled steel silhouette programmed to escape by disappearing behind a heavy berm precisely 3 minutes after activation. Millions of dollars in evaluation metrics, and no small amount of inter-service pride, rested on this single shot. The command was given. The target was live. Thorne settled behind his rifle, his breathing slowing to a meditative rhythm. The world narrowed to the circular view of his scope. He was in his element, a master of his craft. The range fell into a reverent hush, the only sound the whisper of the wind and the distant hum of a generator. And then, a sound that didn't belong. Not the thunderous boom of the 338, but a sharp metallic crack followed by a high-pitched, angry whine. From a different firing point, 1,000 meters to the left where another unit was engaging steel targets, a bullet had fragmented. A piece of the copper jacket, a jagged shard of metal traveling at supersonic speed, cut through the air on a freak trajectory. It was a 1 in a billion chance, an act of pure, malevolent physics. The ricochet tore through the fleshy part of Thorne's left shoulder, the one supporting the rifle's fore end. He cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and surprise, and instinctively rolled away from the weapon, his hand coming up to clutch at the sudden, blossoming heat of the wound. Corpseman, Sullivan bellowed, his arrogance instantly replaced by the raw, panicked instinct of a senior NCO. Man down! Man down! Chaos erupted. Medics rushed forward. The carefully orchestrated exercise dissolved into a scramble of urgent, overlapping shouts. But through the noise, two things remained constant. The timer on the target was still counting down, 90 seconds remaining, and Corporal Rostova had not moved. She stood perfectly still, her eyes not on the wounded SEAL, but on the rifle, lying abandoned on its bipod like a fallen king's scepter. The wind picked up, a gust swirling dust around the firing point. The shimmering heat mirage intensified, making the distant target dance and swim. The shot was already nearly impossible for a master like Thorne. Now it was a ghost, a fantasy. The mission was over. The failure was absolute. But then, as Sullivan was barking orders into his radio, creating more confusion than clarity, Rostova moved. It was not a rush. It was a deliberate, fluid motion, a predator uncoiling. She took the 2 steps back to the mat, her boots making no sound on the dusty ground. The general raised his binoculars again, his heart pounding with a sudden, electric certainty. Corporal, what in the hell do you think you're doing? Get away from that rifle. That is a $200,000 piece of equipment. You're not qualified to even breathe on it. Sullivan's voice was a screech of pure fury and disbelief. He started to move towards her to physically drag her away, but he was a half-second too late. Rostova was already down, settling behind the M210, not with the awkwardness of a novice, but with a practiced, seamless motion that was breathtaking in its efficiency. She didn't just lie down, she became part of the weapon system. Her body formed a stable, solid platform, her shoulders square, her spine aligned perfectly with the barrel. She ignored Sullivan's continued screaming as if he were nothing more than a barking dog in the distance. Her world had shrunk to the rifle, the scope, and the sliver of desert landscape where the target stood. Her hands, which had so carefully unpacked the ammunition, now moved with an even deeper intimacy. Her right hand found the bolt, working it with a smooth, hydraulic press check to confirm a round was seated. Her left hand gently cupped the stock, her fingers applying the slightest pressure to steady the weapon against the recoil she knew was coming. She didn't bother with the wind meter or the data book she had so carefully laid out. There was no time. She lifted her head for a moment, her eyes scanning the full length of the range, feeling the wind on her face, watching the subtle sway of the heat shimmer. She was reading the invisible language of the air itself. Her breathing slowed once, twice. An exhale held at the bottom in the natural respiratory pause. The entire range had gone silent. The medics had stopped. The shouting had ceased. Every eye was locked on the impossible, unbelievable sight of the quiet logistics corporal preparing to take a shot that had humbled seasoned professionals. Sullivan stood frozen, his mouth half open, his words choked in his throat by the sheer, audacious calm of her actions. She made a single-minute adjustment to the parallax knob on the scope, her fingers moving with the delicate confidence of a watchmaker. Then her finger moved to the trigger. The narrator could almost hear the thoughts inside that silent mind. Wind from the left, gusting 7 to 10 miles per hour. Upslope drift. Temperature gradient causing significant mirage. Spin drift at this range is considerable. Target is steel. Aim for center mass of the upper thoracic cavity. Hold left, 2.5 mils. Hold high, 0.3. Breathe. And then a gentle press. Not a pull, not a jerk. A press. The world dissolved into a controlled, violent explosion. The M210 bucked against her shoulder, a roar of contained fury that sent a plume of dust billowing out from the muzzle brake. The recoil, which would have thrown a less experienced shooter completely off target, was absorbed and managed by her perfect posture, her body a masterclass in physics. The rifle settled back onto its bipod almost instantly, and through the scope, she watched the trace of the bullet, a fleeting silver ripple in the superheated air, arc across the immense distance. For a full 2.5 seconds, an eternity stretched thin, the universe held its breath. The Marines on the range, Sullivan, the medics, even the wounded Chief Thorne who had propped himself up on one elbow, all watched the distant target, a tiny speck in the shimmering haze. Then it happened. A flicker of impact, too fast for the eye to truly register, followed a heartbeat later by a clear, distinct clang that echoed back across the desert, a sound of impossible finality. The upper half of the steel silhouette, precisely where she had aimed, kicked violently backward and disappeared from view. A perfect disabling shot. A kill shot. It was followed by a silence more profound, more absolute than any sound. It was a silence born of pure, collective shock. The wind whispered. The generator hummed. But the 100 or so people on that range were utterly, completely still. They stared at the fallen target, then at the small, unassuming woman rising gracefully from behind the rifle, and then back at the target, their minds refusing to reconcile the two realities. Sullivan's face was a pale mask of disbelief, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrifying comprehension. His entire worldview, the carefully constructed hierarchy of competence he had built over 2 decades, had just been vaporized by a single, perfectly placed round. He finally managed to speak, his voice a dry, cracking whisper that carried in the dead air. No way, he breathed. That's not possible, Rostova, for her part. Simply worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, which spun through the air with a soft metallic hiss and landed in the dust. She then engaged the safety, her movements once again calm, methodical, and utterly professional. Her job was done. General Wallace did not run. He strode. His movement across the dusty range was imbued with a purpose and authority that parted the sea of stunned onlookers. The medics resumed their work on Thorne, but their movements were distracted, their eyes continually flicking towards the approaching general and the silent corporal. Wallace walked right past Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, ignoring him as if he were a piece of range equipment. He stopped directly in front of Rostova, who had come to attention, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. For a long moment, the 4-star general and the unassuming corporal stood in silence, an island of stillness in the swirling currents of disbelief. The general's eyes were not accusatory, or even questioning. They were knowing. He looked at her stance, the set of her shoulders, the utter lack of adrenaline-fueled trembling in her hands. He saw the ghost of a past he knew all too well. "Corporal," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the effortless command of a lifetime of leadership. "What is your name?" "Rostova, sir. Corporal Anna Rostova," she replied, her voice steady and clear, betraying no emotion. It was the first time most of the men on the range had ever heard her speak more than a single word. General Wallace nodded slowly. He turned to his aide, who had jogged to keep up with him. "Captain, get on the net to HQ. I want the service record for Corporal Anna Rostova. Full jacket. I don't care what classification it has, my authority. Read it to me, over this channel. Now, sir," the captain stammered, it's heavily restricted. Tier 1 clearance. Code word protected. The general's gaze hardened. "Captain, did you misunderstand my order?" "No, sir." The captain fumbled with his radio, his hands shaking slightly. A moment later, his voice came back, patched through the general's personal headset, so everyone on the command net could hear. "Sir, I have a file." "Stand by," the air crackled. The voice on the other end of the line was clipped, professional, reading from a screen 1,000 miles away. Subject, Rostova Anna. Service number, 988-21-7745. Current rank, Corporal, United States Marine Corps. MOS, 3051, Logistics and Supply Management. Sullivan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. See? Just a box kicker. A lucky shot. A 1 in a million fluke. But the voice from the radio continued, and with each word, Sullivan's certainty began to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Prior service record. The voice from the radio continued, flat and emotionless. United States Army. Rank, Sergeant First Class. Primary MOS. 18D, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. Secondary MOS. 18B, Special Forces Weapons Sergeant. Unit Assignment. Asymmetric Warfare Group, Detachment Kilo. Status, Classified. A murmur went through the assembled officers listening on the command net. Detachment Kilo. Most had never even heard of it. Those who had knew it only as a rumor. A ghost unit that didn't officially exist, tasked with missions that were never spoken of. The voice went on, a relentless, staccato drumbeat of undeniable competence. Combat deployments. Operation Enduring Freedom, 7 tours. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 4 tours. Classified deployments to Horn of Africa, South America, Eastern Europe. Total combat hours. Exceeds 4,000. Sullivan felt his knees go weak. 7 tours in Afghanistan? He had done 2 and considered himself a seasoned veteran. Military schools and qualifications. The voice droned on, a litany of impossible achievements. U.S. Army Special Forces Qualification Course. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Distinguished Honor Graduate. U.S. Army Sniper School. Distinguished Honor Graduate. U.S. Navy SEAL Sniper Course. Naval Special Warfare Center. Guest Instructor. Sullivan's mind reeled. Guest Instructor? She had taught men like Chief Thorne. The list continued, piling improbability upon impossibility. High-angle marksmanship course. Extreme long-range precision rifle course. Covert entry and breaching school. Advanced special operations techniques. Recipient of Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, Bronze Star with V device and 4 Oak Leaf Clusters, Purple Heart with 2 Oak Leaf Clusters, Meritorious Service Medal. The voice was still listing commendations when General Wallace held up a hand. He had heard enough. He turned his full attention back to the corporal, who stood impassively, as if listening to a weather report. He looked at her faded uniform, her unassuming presence, and saw her for what she was, a warrior of the highest caliber, hiding in plain sight. He took 1 step forward, drew himself up to his full height, and rendered a salute. Not the casual salute an officer gives a subordinate, but the sharp, formal salute of profound respect, the kind reserved for Medal of Honor recipients and fallen heroes. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice ringing with authority and a deep, unmistakable reverence, deliberately using her former, higher rank. "My apologies. We have clearly wasted your talents." He then turned his gaze upon Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, and his eyes were chips of ice. "Gunny," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "The most important lesson in leadership is knowing who is in your formation. You spent so much time listening to the sound of your own voice that you failed to recognize the presence of a master. Let this be a lesson to you and to every Marine on this range. Assumptions are the enemy of competence. Pride is the enemy of readiness. You are dismissed. The story of what happened on range 400 did not spread, it detonated. It moved with the speed of gossip and the force of legend. Before the sun had set, every Marine at 29 Palms, from the lowest private in the mess hall to the colonels in the base headquarters, had heard the tale. It was told in 100 different ways, the details shifting with each retelling, but the core elements remained immutable. The arrogant gunny, the quiet supply clerk, the impossible shot, and the general salute. The SEALs in their debriefing room listened as Chief Thorne, his arm now professionally bandaged and in a sling, recounted the event with a sense of awe. "She didn't even use my data," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She just read the air. I've seen maybe 2 other people in my life who can do that. She's a ghost." They pulled up Rostova's file, or what little of it they could access, and a collective, reverent silence filled the room. The legend was given a name. Some started calling her the Ghost of Range 400. Others, with a touch of affection, called her the Ammo Fairy, a mythical creature who not only brought you bullets, but could use them better than anyone alive. The name that stuck, however, was simpler. The firing point itself, a simple patch of dirt and brass, was unofficially christened Rostova's Perch. Marines would walk by it with a new sense of respect, pointing it out to newcomers, telling the story as if it were a piece of essential base history, a modern military folktale. For Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, the fallout was more personal and profound. He was not officially reprimanded. The general's public dressing down was punishment enough, but he was isolated by a sudden, chilling silence. His bluster and bravado, once seen as the hallmarks of a seasoned leader, now seemed like the pathetic posturing of a fool. He ate alone in the chow hall. His usual crowd of junior NCOs who orbited him for war stories found other company. He was forced to marinate in his own humiliation, the memory of Rostova's calm, silent competence playing over and over in his mind. He replayed his own words, his sneering insults, his blind arrogance, and they tasted like ash in his mouth. He had not just been wrong. He had been a caricature of the very thing he despised, an officer who judged a book by its cover, a leader who valued noise over substance. The foundation of his identity was cracked, and through that crack, a painful, necessary light was beginning to shine in. The next morning, as the sun began its relentless assault on the desert, Rostova was back at her duties, loading a 5-ton truck with crates of water. To any casual observer, she was exactly the same person she had been 24 hours earlier, a quiet, efficient logistics corporal. Her movements were just as precise, her expression just as neutral. There was no hint of pride, no flicker of triumph in her eyes. The event might as well have happened to someone else. It was this absolute lack of change that perhaps solidified her legend more than the shot itself. She didn't want credit. She didn't need validation. Her competence was its own reward. It was there that Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan found her. He approached her not with a swagger, but with a hesitant, almost shuffling gait. He looked older, smaller. The bluster had been stripped away, leaving behind a man raw with humility. The small group of Marines working with Rostova fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Corporal," Sullivan began, his voice rough. He cleared his throat and corrected himself, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "Sergeant." Rostova. She stopped working and turned to face him, her expression patient, waiting. He started, then stopped. He took a deep breath. "Yesterday, I was unprofessional. I was arrogant, and I was wrong. I disrespected you in front of my Marines, and I failed to provide them with a good example of leadership. There's no excuse for it. I came here to apologize. To you." He stood there, his apology hanging in the hot, still air. He was prepared for anything, a tirade, a dismissive sneer, a lecture. He did not expect what came next. Rostova simply looked at him for a moment, her gaze analytical but not unkind, and then she gave a single, small nod of acceptance. That was it. No words. No recriminations. Just a simple, silent gesture of closure. The nod was a release. For Sullivan, it was a profound lesson in grace. He felt the crushing weight of his shame lift, replaced by a nascent, unfamiliar sense of respect. As he turned to leave, Rostova spoke, her voice quiet. Gunny, he stopped and turned back. When you're cleaning the bowl on that M210, she said, use a nylon brush, not a brass one. The receiver is coated. Brass will strip it over time. She then turned back to her work, lifting another case of water as if the conversation had never happened. Sullivan stood frozen for a second, stunned. It was not a boast. It was a simple, professional piece of advice offered freely. It was a master sharing a small piece of her craft. It was in that moment that he finally understood. Her silence wasn't a weakness. It was a fortress. Her world was not about being recognized. It was about being right. Months later, on that same range, a new class of Marine Corps Scout sniper candidates were gathered at Rostova's perch. The instructor, a different gunnery sergeant, pointed to the firing position. This spot has a name, he told the young, eager Marines. We call it Rostova's perch. And before any of you fire a single round from here, you're going to hear the story of why he told them the tale, which had now been polished by repetition into a perfect parable. He told them about the arrogant gunny who saw only a uniform and a rank, not the warrior within. He told them about the quiet corporal who spoke the universal language of competence. And he told them about the impossible shot that had become a benchmark for excellence, a shot they would all dream of one day making. The story had become institutionalized, a formal part of the range brief, a mandatory lesson in the dangers of assumption. The legacy of Corporal Rostova was not a plaque on a wall or a medal on a uniform. It was a subtle but profound shift in culture. Junior Marines started looking at the logistics personnel, the mechanics, the cooks, with a new curiosity and nascent respect. The quiet ones, the ones who just did their jobs without fanfare, were no longer invisible. They were mysteries, potential masters hiding in plain sight. Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan became a changed man. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. He became known as one of the most demanding, but also one of the most perceptive leaders in his battalion. He was merciless on NCOs who displayed arrogance or belittled their subordinates. His new mantra, repeated so often it became a running joke, was, "You never know who's running your ammo." As for Rostova, she was gone. A week after the incident, she received a new set of classified orders. She packed her small bag, signed her clearing papers, and vanished from the base as quietly as she had served on it. There was no farewell party, no ceremony. She simply disappeared back into the shadows from which she had briefly, spectacularly emerged. Her file was sealed once more, her official record scrubbed back to the simple, unassuming designation of logistics corporal. Her presence was gone, but her echo remained, a permanent part of the desert, a silent lesson carried in the wind. Years passed. General Wallace stood at a podium, addressing the graduating class of a new generation of Marine officers. It was his retirement speech, his last official act after a lifetime of service. He spoke of leadership, of sacrifice, and of the changing nature of warfare. And at the end of his speech, he told them one last story. He told them of a hot day in the desert, of a brash gunnery sergeant and a legendary SEAL. But the hero of his story was a corporal, a woman most of the world would never know, a quiet professional who had taught him, a four-star general, one of the most valuable lessons of his career. True strength, he said, his voice resonating with the conviction of lived experience, is rarely loud. True competence does not need to announce itself. In a world obsessed with noise, with self-promotion, with being seen, the most powerful individuals are often the ones who are content to simply be. To be excellent, to be professional, to be ready. He looked out at the sea of young, eager faces, the future leaders of his beloved Corps. Your greatest challenge will not be the enemy on the battlefield. It will be the enemy within your own mind. The arrogance that breeds assumption, the pride that blinds you to the quiet excellence that surrounds you every day. Look for the Corporal Rostovas in your ranks. Find them, trust them, learn from them, for they're the true bedrock of any great organization. A legacy is not a monument of stone. It is not a name carved into a wall. True legacy is a story told from one generation to the next. It is a lesson that changes behavior. It is the quiet, enduring echo of an action that demonstrated a timeless truth. That character is measured not by the volume of your voice, but by the precision of your actions. It is the understanding that the highest form of respect is not given through ceremony, but earned through silent, undeniable competence. For more stories where quiet professionalism triumphs over loud ignorance, and where character defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.